All right, get ready because we are going deep into some spooky New York City stories with the Haunting Hostel. We're looking at a paranormal podcast episode from Shadows of the Unknown, and we're going to see if this place is as scary as they say it is.
What's really interesting is that this isn't some giant creepy mansion or anything. It's actually a pretty normal building on the Lower East Side, and not even in a well-known part. It was built way back in the late 1800s.
It's not hard to imagine that a place like that would have some, energy left behind. Shadows of the Unknown mentions that it used to be a boarding house for immigrants, so there's all this history, hopes and dreams, but also maybe anxieties just kind of soaked into the walls.
Yeah, that's like the perfect recipe for a haunting, don't you think? Especially when you hear about the hostel's most famous room, Room 306.
Oh, yeah, Room 306. That's where things get really interesting. The podcast talks about this guy, Daniel, a backpacker who stayed there. And what's crazy is that he was totally skeptical at first, like the kind of traveler who doesn't believe in ghost stories at all.
Right? He probably thought it was all just stories people told. But then he has this experience that's so real and terrifying. He wakes up in the middle of the night and hears this heavy breathing. So he turns on the light, and right there at the foot of his bed is this woman with a really scary, distorted face and totally empty eyes.
Oh, that's creepy. And the podcast really goes into the details. Like she lunges at him, he runs out of the room, and later the cleaning staff finds scratch marks all over the walls. It's like a classic ghost story. But what makes this one so scary?
I think it's all in the details. The heavy breathing, how they describe the woman's face, the fact that there were actual scratch marks, it makes it seem real. It's not just a feeling of unease, it's a really scary experience that you can almost see and touch.
And Shadows of the Unknown makes it clear that Daniel wasn't the only one. They say that tons of guests have had similar experiences in room 306. So is this room really haunted, or is there another explanation? Like maybe people are playing pranks on the guests.
Yeah, I mean, that's always possible. But what if we just go with the idea that these experiences are real? Why would room 306 be such a hotspot for all this paranormal activity?
That's a great question. The podcast mentions some pretty interesting theories, like maybe there was a woman murdered there who wants revenge, or an ancient entity that feeds off fear. They even talk about the building being a portal between worlds.
Oh, wow, those are some pretty wild ideas.
Hmm.
But before we get too carried away with the paranormal stuff, maybe we should think about the history of the building. The podcast mentions that it might be built on top of an old burial ground that wasn't marked. That could explain some of what's happening.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Imagine all those souls trapped under the building. It makes those ghost stories even creepier?
It really does. And think about all the people who lived in that building when it was a boarding house. All the hardships they went through, maybe even some tragedies we don't know about. It makes sense that some of that energy could still be there, maybe even showing itself in ways that seem paranormal.
Shadows of the Unknown also presents some evidence like EVP recordings and some weird readings from thermal imaging.
Right? Those are like the classic paranormal investigation tools. But before we get into that, can you explain to our listener what those are and why people are always debating whether they're reliable?
Sure. EVP stands for electronic voice phenomena, which is basically trying to record the voices of spirits on electronic devices. And thermal imaging is used to find differences in temperature, which some people believe can show where a spirit is.
Right, exactly. And while those tools are definitely interesting, it's important to remember that what they show is open to interpretation. A sound that seems like a ghostly voice could just be radio interference, and a change in temperature could be caused by a draft or a broken heater. So it's really important to be skeptical of this kind of evidence.
Absolutely. We have to separate what's really scary from what's actually true. But the podcast also gets into something a little darker, some mysterious deaths connected to the hostel. There's this story of a young artist named Claire Anderson that really sticks out.
Oh yeah, Claire's story is really scary because it's not just about seeing a ghost, it's about something really bad happening.
She was staying at the hostel while she was looking for an apartment. One night, people heard her talking to someone in her room, but the next morning she was found dead in the stairwell. There were no signs of violence or a suicide note, just this look of pure terror on her face.
And what makes it even creepier is the security footage from that night. You can see her walking down the hallway alone, but when she gets to room 306, she stops, turns her head like she's listening to something, and then screams right before the footage cuts out.
That's a chilling detail. It makes you wonder if there's something we're missing. But is it really unexplained, or are there explanations that the podcast missed? Could there be logical reasons for Claire's death that they just haven't found?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's definitely something to keep in mind as we dig deeper into this hostel and all its mysteries.
Wow, it really seems like this hostel is full of mysteries, huh? But with all these different theories, it's hard to know where to start. What do you think is the most interesting theory so far?
Hmm. Well, the idea that the hostel was built right on top of an unmarked burial ground really makes you think. It kind of connects the age of the building and where it is to all the weird stuff that's been happening there. Imagine all those people buried there, not able to rest peacefully, and now this hostel is built right on top of them.
Yeah, that's a really creepy thought, especially when you think about all those immigrants who stayed there, all the emotions they must have had, their hopes, their fears, maybe even some really sad events that we don't know about. It's like all that could still be trapped in the building.
Exactly. But what about that theory about the building being some kind of portal? Now, that one is really interesting. It's like thinking that maybe other realities are somehow leaking into ours through this hostel.
That's a pretty mind-blowing idea. And when you think about how Claire reacted outside room 306, the way she suddenly got so scared and screamed before the security footage cut out, it does make you wonder if maybe she saw something we just can't understand, something that doesn't even belong in our world.
That's a scary thought for sure.
Yeah.
But let's take a step back from the paranormal stuff for a second and think about the Shadows of the Unknown podcast itself. Do you think they're trying to do a serious investigation, or is it more about entertainment? Does the way they present things affect how we see the information?
That's a good point. They definitely play up the mystery and try to make it suspenseful, which makes it fun to listen to. But we have to remember they're storytellers. Their job is to keep us hooked, maybe even a little scared.
Right, exactly. So even though they might find some really interesting things, we also have to be aware that they might be exaggerating
Mm.
or only telling us certain parts of the story. It's like watching one of those true crime documentaries.
Hmm.
You always have to keep in mind that there's probably a lot more to the story than they're showing us.
Okay, so let's pretend we're the ones in charge of this investigation. How would you go about figuring out the truth about the haunting hostel? Would you focus on personal experiences or would you try to be more scientific about it?
Hmm. I think the best way is to have a mix of both. Personal stories are really important because they give us an idea of what it's like to experience something strange and unexplained. But we also need some hard evidence to back it up. If it were me, I'd start by really digging into the history of the hostel.
So, like doing a deep dive into all the historical records, what kind of stuff would you be looking for?
Well, first, I'd want to see if those rumors about a murder back in the 1920s are true. I'd look through property records, old newspapers, anything they could tell us about the people who lived there and what happened in the building. And of course, I'd try to figure out if there really is a burial ground under the hostel.
Yeah, knowing the history is super important. It could help us understand if these hauntings are connected to certain people or events from the past, or if there's just this overall creepy energy in the building. What about those paranormal investigation tools? Would you use EVP recorders and thermal cameras?
I think those tools can be helpful, but you have to use them carefully and not just believe everything they show. EVP recordings are easy to misinterpret, and things like drafts can affect thermal readings.
So basically, you'd use those tools to gather information, but you wouldn't take what they show you as proof.
Right, exactly. I'd focus more on documenting everything really well, taking lots of pictures, writing down any strange sounds or temperature changes. I'd also create a timeline of all the events to see if there are any patterns, like if the hauntings happen more at certain times or on certain dates. Sometimes you can find clues that point you in the right direction if you look closely enough.
That sounds like a really careful approach. It's like you're putting together a giant puzzle, trying to figure out the mystery of this hostel one piece at a time.
Exactly. And even though the goal is to find out the truth, the process of getting there can be just as important. You learn so much from investigating, analyzing evidence, and considering different points of view. That's where the real discoveries happen.
It's like we're not just investigating a building, we're also learning about how people believe in things, what they choose to believe, the stories they tell, and how all that shapes their experiences.
And that brings us back to you, the listener. What do you find the most interesting about this case? Is it the creepy stories, the potential tragedies from the past, or the idea that there might be something out there we just don't understand?
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. I'm sure our listeners have their own theories. But as we wrap up our deep dive into the haunting hostel, I have to ask one last question. Would you actually spend the night in the haunting hostel?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It would be like, really putting yourself right in the middle of all those spooky stories.
Part of me is so curious, but then the other part, well, let's just say I'd have to think about that for a while.
Yeah, I get it. It's one thing to talk about these stories, but to actually be there and maybe experience something yourself, yeah, that's totally different.
Totally. But even if we never actually go to the haunting hostel, I still think it's important to explore stories like these. It makes us think about all the things we don't know,
Yeah.
and question what we think is real and what might be out there beyond what we can see and hear.
Yeah, for sure. And it reminds us that history isn't just like dates and names in a book. It's all about people and what they went through, the good and the bad, and even the stuff we can't explain.
So, to all our listeners out there, we want to leave you with this. If you were going to investigate the haunting hostel, how would you do it? Would you focus on people's stories, use science, or maybe do a little bit of both?
And even more importantly, what do you believe? Are you open to the idea of ghosts and the paranormal? Or do you think there's always a logical explanation for everything?
That's what's so cool about a deep dive like this. There's no easy answer. It makes you ask more questions, see things from different angles, and just makes you wonder about all the mysteries out there in the world.
And you never know, maybe someday we'll get to do our own investigation, separate fact from fiction, and really find out what's going on at the haunting hostel.
Until then, sleep tight and don't let the bedbugs bite.